Now, I would like to bring the greetings from the UNA branch which I chair, which is the Cardiff and District branch. I'm not the only person from that branch present, because I noticed my colleague Sarah Boyce present as well. But we are a middle-sized branch, not the only one in Wales, but almost the only one. We've been going a long time because we were founded in 1948, and we've recently had speakers such as Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, who happens to live in Cardiff, and also Sir Emma Jones-Parry, former British representative at the United Nations itself, who lives nearby. And we have all sorts of plans for further meetings. With a bit of luck, you may see a poster for our next meeting, maybe supplied at a later stage. So my subject this evening is climate justice, and I'll embark on talking about that directly. Climate justice concerns fairness between the different parties affecting or affected by the climate. These parties are not confined to the human beings currently alive in different parts of the world, important as these are. Its scope also extends to future generations and to creatures of other living species too. Now, there are problems in ascribing rights to either of these groups, but they still need the kind of fairness that climate justice involves. This shows that justice is not just a matter of rights and has an importantly larger extent. It extends to wherever there are creatures with needs. Take future generations. It is not clear that they have rights against people currently alive, for various technical reasons that philosophers love and I do not need to go into here. Although future human beings will have rights against their contemporaries when they come into being. But we can, in any case, make a large difference to their prospects, to how things will go for them when they come into being. Thus, if we manage to live sustainably and to stabilize the human population as soon as we can, then they, the future human beings, will inherit a world in which life will be worth living, with sustainable practices that they can pass on to their successors. But if we fail, then many future people will suffer from extreme weather events, caused, for example, by global warming, from shortages of fresh water, and from rising sea levels, with the seas and oceans perpetually encroaching on what is currently inhabitable territory. Climate justice also applies to the future generations of other species. If we continue to allow species to go extinct, then there will be no future generations of many species. So it is up to the present generation whether future generations of the full range of current species will come into being or not. And the most obvious way to facilitate this is to preserve the current generation of other species, who are the key to their species continuing into the future. And this underlines what was becoming apparent in any case, which is that we have obligations of justice towards members of other species, as well as towards members of our own species. This view is often contested or disputed, but the opposing views lead to paradoxes. And the problems are in fact tackled head on in a pair of joint papers written by Rebecca Humphreys and myself, details of which you may with great luck be able to see in the chat. I doubt if it has yet arrived there, but my good friend Nigel Dower whom I've known since we were both at university, has agreed to supply some pieces of information in the chat, and I guess he will be doing that before long. With this background in mind, we can begin to work out what climate justice involves. Fortunately, humanity has made a good start in banning the chemicals that erode the ozone layer, CFCs and HCFCs. Shall I spell out what CFCs are? Chlorofluorocarbons. I won't try to spell out the other one. The ozone layer, which protects all animals, including human beings, from skin cancer. This was achieved partly through the Montreal Protocol of 1987 and partly by the London revisions of 1988. The ozone layer is now well on the way to being restored to its condition before these chemicals were invented. We were actually very fortunate to discover that they were ruining the ozone layer, which of course we had to do between them being invented and the solution being found. But where greenhouse gas emissions are concerned, it is no longer possible to restore the climate to its condition prior to industrialization. What we need to achieve is to limit increases in average temperature to 1.5 degrees centigrade above that level. With any greater increase, many islands will disappear under the waves of the ocean, and coastlines everywhere will be at risk. As things are, we are suffering extreme weather events with stronger and more frequent floods, droughts, storms, and wildfires. To limit temperature increases and yet more extreme weather events, we need to mitigate our emissions of carbon and other greenhouse gases too, from homes, offices, manufacturing, farming, transport, and travel. I hope that others will speak about ways and means, which must include a transition from carbon-based energy generation to renewable energy generation. Further, all countries need to adapt to the emissions that are by now irretrievable. This will mean protecting infrastructures, both of communications and of energy transmission, of water supply and of drainage, not only in the West, but in developing countries as well. This is going to require funding, which in view of the urgency of the situation and the levels of indebtedness of many developing countries, should be standardly based on grants rather than on loans. It will also require the world's creditor nations, which includes Britain, to agree to what the UN General Assembly has already voted for, a system of allowing international bankruptcy, which will allow indebted countries to declare themselves bankrupt, and from that point, after whatever payment can be achieved, to be spared further debt repayments, enabling them to tackle issues of development, including adaptation to climate change. Besides, the introduction of mitigation and adaptation, I'll say that again. Besides the introduction of mitigation and adaptation and financial schemes to make them possible, humanity needs to introduce sustainable practices so that future generations of every species are able to enjoy and benefit from the benefits of a tolerable climate and of biodiversity, and so that future human generations are able to enjoy the benefits of human culture, including art and music and all the rest, much as we are able to do. While I do not have time to sketch sustainable policies in general, it is appropriate to allude to the areas in which sustainable practices are going to be needed. Those areas include farming, forestry, and fisheries. Many other areas will need to be made sustainable, such as education, manufacturing, and transport. But farming, forestry, and fishing have a closer link to climate justice for non-human species in particular. Climate justice for farmed species means the ending of factory farming. It means fish farming that is less intensive, and it means forestry that is at least sustainable, and that in many places ceased to harvest forests for timber altogether, so that forest biocommunities can flourish without being continually cleared, that is to say, without being continually cut down. For climate justice involves respect for biodiversity and provision for it being sustained, both in forests and elsewhere. There are also implications for the human population. Now, fortunately, there is already a tendency for couples to have fewer children, which is spreading across Asia and Latin America, and brings closer the stabilization of the human population. I'd like to refer here to the book by Rosling of 2018, and with some luck, perhaps that will be added to the chat so that people are able to note it. It was the main author had already died, and his son Ola jointly published with his father this book. Now, many factors make this stabilizing of population desirable, such as the limits to the amount of available fresh water, the difficulty of feeding the current population of between 7 and 8 billion, and the difficulty of finding the other resources that this population needs if all are to enjoy the possibility of a good life. If the human population can be stabilized within decades at a level of 10 or 11 billion rather than more, that would mean that it would also be possible to set aside more land as green spaces where non-human species could continue to thrive. Now the organizers may be glad to hear comes the last bit of my talk. Climate justice begins with people, including people in developing countries enjoying a tolerable climate and decent homes, and not suffering injury or illness from severe weather events. In particular, those who have contributed little or nothing to climate change, and that is very many people in third world countries, such people should not be made to suffer its adverse impacts. That's the reverse of climate justice. But it also means this for our human successors of the foreseeable future, and for the other species with which we share the planet, as I have tried to explain in various books, which may or may not appear in the chat before long. Viable habitats need to be left for all the species that have evolved on our planet, and in this way, biodiversity loss can be halted, and biodiversity can continue to be enjoyed both by humanity, that's us, and the other species that comprise the biodiversity of the Earth. In closing, I would like to thank you all for this opportunity to address UNA Scotland on an issue of such fundamental importance.